show my screen. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Lynn Rubenstein. I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Recycling Council, and I am delighted to have you with us today. We are going to be hearing about, hopefully you already knew this, global best practices for container deposit laws, and the webinar is co-sponsored by NERC and NMOA, the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors. Gold sponsors are ADS and Vanguard, and silver sponsor is Nestle Waters, and bronze sponsor is Tomra. I'd like to note that this webinar is being recorded. Importantly, I want you to ask questions. And the way you do that is to use the question box. So on the right-hand side of your computer screen, either it's showing up or you've got a little orange arrow. Click on the orange arrow and you'll see the question box. And so you type your question into that. I'll be monitoring them and we're going to save them until the end of the presentation, until after all three of our speakers have gone ahead. Recording of the webinar will be available on NERC's website tomorrow, and you will receive an email with that information. With that, I'd like to turn to our content, and I'm going to introduce all three of our speakers, and then they'll get to present. So first, we're going to be hearing from Susan Collins, the president of the Container Recycling Institute. She has worked on recycling and sustainability issues for more than 25 years. She leads CRI's research and works with environmental organizations, activists, and governments around the world to educate on the benefits of packaging recycling. She's a member of the National Recycling Coalition and a former board member of the California Resource Recovery Association. Susan will be followed by Chuck Riegel, Senior Vice President, Government Affairs and DRS Compliance for Tomra Systems. Chuck started his career heading the Recycling and Solid Waste Division of the City of Norwalk, Connecticut, developing residential and commercial waste collection programs. He has served on both the Town of Greenwich Conservation Commission and Albemarle County Solid Waste Alternatives Advisory Committee. He is Tomra's Senior Vice President of Government Affairs, and in that role, he works with stakeholders to accelerate the transformation to a circular economy. And bringing it all home for us will be Sarah Edwards from Eunomia. She is the North American CEO of Eunomia Research and Consulting, a leading international resource management and circular economy consultancy. She has over 20 years experience in the waste sector and has previously delivered infrastructure projects for Veolia, one of the world's largest waste management companies, as well as implemented curbside programs for municipalities. Most recently, Sarah's work has concentrated on extended producer responsibility, covering both beverage deposit systems as well as wider packaging programs. So with that, I'd like to say thank you and turn it to our speakers. And I'm going to make Susan the presenter, and we get to hear from her. So thank you so much, Susan. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you to you and NERC for hosting us today and for covering this topic. And good morning and good afternoon to everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about the past, present, and future of container deposit laws. I'll be going over some of the benefits of deposit laws, as well as past, present, and future, the history, and where we think they're going in the next few years. So to start with, the issue of beverage containers is sometimes trivialized. It's sometimes talked about as though there's not that many beverage containers that we have to deal with, but it's actually more than most people think of. This is a photograph of one person's consumption of beverage containers. So
Susan, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there is no picture there. It's a blank page. Maybe you need to advance the screen.
Sure. Let me see if it's maybe just this one slide that's malfunctioning. I'll go to the next one. Can you see that one?
Well, okay. I can't. Do you want me to show it? We could do that.
I think that's a good idea, Lynn. If all of my
Okay,
slides are coming across as blank, then they'll be
sure.
much better if everybody can see them.
Well, yeah. Okay, hang on. We're gonna make me the presenter, one hopes. Let's see here. Make presenter, show my screen, and we're going to go to a different PowerPoint. We'll be there in just a moment.
Yes,
And
please hold during this
slideshow.
silence.
There you go. Okay, now we got
Great,
that.
I can hear
And
it.
now we
Great,
have this beautiful picture. Okay.
here we go. Thank you so much,
Sure.
Lynn.
Yeah. Do you want me to advance it at this point or let everybody admire the photo?
I would like to talk about the photo before
Okay,
we move on.
that's good.
So thank you for your foresight in having the PowerPoints on your end as well to absorb this kind of a technical difficulty. So this photograph is one person's consumption of beverage containers. It's about 822 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. And this is a good representation of the right number of wine bottles versus milk bottles versus soda bottles, etc., and also the right mixture of glass versus plastic versus aluminum. So this is really what one person's average consumption looks like. So next slide, please. And we're not stopping there. We're at 822. A few years ago, it was in the 700s, but we're increasing nationally in our population, and our per capita consumption is growing. So those two have a multiplier effect. So we're producing more and more and more beverage containers every year. We measure beverage containers in billions. So we consume about 268 billion beverage containers every year in the United States. Next slide, please. And the leader is now water, the category of water. It used to be that soda was the biggest thing that we consumed by units, but now because water has gotten so popular, we now consume about 71 billion bottles of water every year. And you can see here that it has grown more than 20-fold in the last 22 years. It started at about 3 billion in 1996, and now we're at 71 billion for 2018. Next slide, please. So this is, yeah, you can click through these, 2 more clicks, I think. Thank you. So before I get into the benefits of a deposit system, just in case there's somebody on this webinar who's not familiar with a beverage container deposit, I'll say that the most simple way to describe it is that when a consumer purchases a beverage to drink, they pay not only the price of the beverage, but they also pay a small deposit. It's usually 5 or 10 cents in the United States. And then when they're done drinking that and they want to recycle the empty, they can turn it in for redemption and get their deposit back. So that's what we mean by beverage container deposit systems. So the benefits are, first, the incentive itself, that small deposit, produces very high recycling rates. They range from 50 to 95% here in the US. They produce clean recycled materials for manufacturing, because when the items are returned for recycling, they're returned by material type. The material types are never mixed together. They also reduce litter. People are less inclined to litter containers, and then even if they do litter it, someone else will come along and pick that up in order to get the deposit back. They also shift the end-of-life costs for used beverage containers to the producers. They conserve energy, reduce greenhouse gases and natural resources, and they create jobs that can't be outsourced to other countries. Next slide, please. We have learned over many years, this snapshot shows a 20-year period where we were tracking curbside recycling access and beverage container recycling rates. We've learned that curbside is good for a lot of materials, and it does generally service the residential sector, but it's not broad enough to really deliver a high recycling rate for beverage containers. As a matter of fact, we've seen that over time, as curbside access has been expanded to cover more and more households throughout the United States, the beverage container recycling rate has actually gone down. So the beverage containers that are getting recycled in really high quantities in the US are really getting recycled in the states that have beverage container deposit laws. Next slide, please. So here we have US recycling rates by deposit status. So regardless of what state it's in, the containers on the left are the deposit containers, and the containers on the right are the non-deposit containers. And you can see that the bars on the left are much, much higher, meaning the redemption rates and the recycling rates are very high for the deposit containers. And if containers are not on deposit, even if they're in a deposit state, there are some states that don't cover all of the beverage containers. So if there's not a deposit, they won't be recovered at a high rate. Next slide, please. Lynn, I'm not seeing it. Oh, there we go. There we go. So we see that the deposits that exist in just those 10 states, and Lynn, give it one more click. There's another part of this that needs to come up. Nearly half of all of the beverage containers that are recycled in the US come from just those 10 bottle bill states, even though they only have 28% of the population. Next slide. Also, we know that the deposit itself is an incentive, and this next piece is very logical. The larger the deposit, the stronger the incentive. So the two states that have a 10-cent deposit are shown here in orange, and they have some of the highest rates of redemption in those states. And then over on the left, the states that only have a 5-cent deposit have lower rates, and actually those rates have been declining in recent years. So a nickel isn't enough anymore. It really needs to be a dime. Next slide, please. Oregon has made that change. Oregon did have a 5-cent redemption rate up until a couple of years ago, and I'm sorry, a 5-cent deposit. And they have increased their deposit to 10 cents. That happened in the middle of 2017. Beforehand, they had a redemption rate of 64%. After the 10-cent deposit went into place, they're now achieving the high 80s for their redemption rate. So they achieved a 22 percentage point increase in their redemption rate as a result of going from 5 cents to 10 cents. Next slide, please. The other thing that happens, which is really interesting, is that because deposit scrap is so clean, it is more valuable than single stream material. And so PET plastic, for instance, it's typically 40%, it's priced 40% higher than curbside PET. And we see the same thing with glass. Curbside glass usually has a charge of about $20 a ton to recycle, whereas deposit glass that is very clean is worth $20. So the same material in the same state, if you're processing it through curbside recycling, if you just make the change to processing it through curbside to having it on deposit, you actually see that material is suddenly worth more money. So as an economic development tool, it's very powerful. Next slide, please. And this is just one slide I wanted to show you for litter. This is one example. I know the states at the bottom are really small, but those are in the Great Lakes area, Indiana, Wisconsin, etc. In blue, those have a much higher level of beverage containers in their litter stream. Over on the right, that's Michigan. They have a deposit law, and they have half the beverage container litter that those other states do. And the interesting thing is Michigan has what I call half a deposit law. Michigan only covers carbonated beverages in their law. They don't even cover wine and spirits and water and tea and those kind of things. So Michigan's litter for beverage container litter would be even lower if Michigan had a complete deposit law. Next slide, please. Recently, with the coronavirus pandemic, we saw shutdowns of several programs in March and April, and some of them lasted even into May and June. And it was a huge shock to the system for the recycling industries that are dependent on the container deposit material. We see at the very bottom, the last row, I know there's a lot of information in this slide, but really just pay attention to the last row of data, where it shows that 40% of the aluminum cans that are recycled in the US are coming through those deposit programs. For PET bottles, it's more than 50%. For glass, it's 48%. So altogether, 46% of the containers that are recovered in this country are coming through those deposit systems. So when the deposit systems were shut down during the coronavirus, it was a huge shock to the system. It was hard on the supply chain, and it made the producers of those containers that much more aware of how important these deposit systems were. And they actually came out with press releases indicating how important these deposit systems are and indicating their increased support for the deposit systems as a result of this. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm going to touch on a few slides on recycled content. As much as we've heard beverage companies having goals for use of recycled content, it really isn't a widespread practice when it comes to PET in bottles. And PET is what's used for soda bottles and water bottles primarily. We've seen over time that the total recycled content in PET bottles has ranged from under 3% to, at its highest point, between 8 and 9%. And that's on average throughout the entire US, but that means that under 10% of all the bottles out there have recycled content, and more than 90% of all PET that's used to make beverage containers is virgin plastic. So the state legislatures are really starting to notice this, and I think we're going to see more recycled content laws coming forward in the next couple of years. Next slide. So here's what's happened in California. This is very new information. This just happened 1 month ago. California had a couple of attempts. Last year, the bill was passed and then got vetoed. This year, they made some adjustments to it. The law passed and it was signed by the governor. So it is now a law. And the law requires 15% minimum recycled content in plastic beverage bottles by 2022. That ramps up to 25% by 2025 and 50% by 2030. That 50% number is actually the highest in the world. It's more than what the European Union did. The European Union also has a recycled content law for plastic bottles, but their cap it goes up to 30%, whereas California's bill goes up to 50% by 2030. Next slide, please. Around the world, these container deposit laws have never been more popular. It's been absolutely incredible. Up until the year 2017, we had seen container deposit laws cover a little under 300 million people around the world. So that was a 47-year period, because the first container deposit law passed in 1970 in British Columbia. So over that 47-year period, we saw enough laws that they covered 300 million people. Then, all of a sudden, just in the last 3.5 years, we've seen coverage of another 351 million people. In other words, it got to a certain point in 47 years, and then in 3.5 years, more than doubled. So this is the list, and I keep having to update this slide every couple of months because more new deposit laws passed. Ireland is another place that has now announced that they'll be implementing a container deposit law soon. So many of those on this list have already been implemented, but the ones toward the end of the list are going to be implemented within the next couple of years. Next slide, please. This is what the story I just told you, this is what it looks like plotted out on a graph. Altogether, this is going to be 635 million people that are going to be covered. But it shows this graph starts all the way back at 0 in 1970 when British Columbia passed their law, and it moves forward in time, and you can see the tremendous growth of just the last few years where the graph turns into a nearly vertical line as we're adding more provinces and countries so quickly. Next slide, please. So next slide. This is the recent uptick in legislation here in the United States. So we're bringing this home now. Click again, there we go. So there were 9 states that introduced new bills in the US in 2019, and that was more than we had seen in a 10-year period. Usually it's just 2 or 3 states introducing a bill, so 9 was a big deal. And then toward the end of the year, we started to hear about the national bill, and by February of 2020, we had seen 2 bills introduced in the national legislature and Congress. Next slide, please. So this is just a sampling of some of the bottle bill legislation that was introduced in early 2020, but it adds another state to the list. Rhode Island is on this slide, and Rhode Island was not on the previous slide. So there's even more activity going on in more states to look at introducing new container deposit laws in new states in the US. Next slide, please. I'm just going to touch on this a little bit to let everybody know this project is going on and let you know to watch for it. With all of this activity, we are, of course, receiving a lot of requests with people asking us if we have model legislation. So we're working on a model legislation project this year. Next slide. And this model legislation project goes in 4 phases. We're now in phase 3. So the first phase was just to identify the best practice principles and key elements, sort of the outline of the project that we were going to do. And we did that in consultation with the Container Recycling Institute board and our Business Advisory Council members. Then back in March, we hosted a 1-day conference to showcase best practices. And that March conference, in entirety, the entire 1-day conference, all 6 hours of the material, is available for free on our website. All the PowerPoints are there and the videos are there. Now we're in phase 3, where we are 4 parts into a 10-part series of meetings where we're discussing these key elements in more detail with our Business Advisory Council so that we can take that information and create a guidebook in phase 4. So that'll be coming next April or May, I think, is when we finish the 10 monthly meetings that we're having. So I just want to let everybody know that that's coming, that we will have a guidebook on what a model deposit law covers. Next slide. So we'd like to thank our business partner members who are helping us through this process. And on the next slide, we've got some information on how you can reach us. We have 2 different websites, and we're also on LinkedIn and Facebook. And we also have a free weekly headlines newsletter. And with that, I'll turn it back to Lynn. And Lynn, thank you again very much.
My pleasure. And as always, that was an amazing presentation. So thank you so much. And you've been getting kudos, so don't feel that you haven't. So with that, we're going to turn it to Chuck Regal. Thank you, Susan. And Chuck, I'm making you the presenter.
Okay.
And we'll take it away, hopefully. So hopefully you won't have issues, but I am ready.
All right. Looks like, can you see the deck now?
I see it.
All right.
Excellent. Although I think you should probably be in slideshow mode, which you're not yet. And Susan, not that we don't think you're gorgeous, but you might want to turn your camera off. There you go. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Lynn, and your team for putting this together. It's I do like speaking to the folks in the member states of NERC, where Commerce actually has a lot of its business. And I appreciate the sort of the comment Susan gave already, which talks about sort of how a deposit system works and many of its benefits. It'll be a lot easier for me then to talk about the best practices and what we want to share here. So many of you all know Tamra in one way or another, whether it's as the system operator for the deposit system, pickup processing, reverse vending machines, the clearinghouse, and you're also familiar with our optical sorting systems that help curbside programs attain their material quality and sorting out containers and fiber. Internally, a little bit like what Susan had mentioned, she's taking her members through. Internally, Tamra's also considering how we can play our part, play the role in reforming recycling systems. We see the challenges everyone else does and want to be able to participate and add value for our customers and fellow stakeholders. And we think,
Excuse me, Chuck, I'm
yes.
sorry to interrupt, but
Yep.
Somebody like me is having trouble, who has old eyes, sorry, the other person. Are you able to make the display larger?
Oh.
Let's see. If you can't, you can't, but I don't know. Let's see. Don't spend too much time on it. Okay, we tried. Thank you. Bye.
Sorry, I'm trying to think about display settings.
Don't worry about it, Chuck. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. All right. Well, sorry for everyone. This will be available, and I'm sure you'll hear us talk more about it at future opportunities. Deposit systems are complex. Anybody who's worked in this business, I think, still learns something new when they go to a new state. One of the advantages I've got in my role is I work in all of them in the U.S. and Canada, and get that chance to see what's working, what's not working, what's from our perspective as an operator, from the perspective of other our customers and other stakeholders, and because Tamra's international, I get to understand the sort of how things are working in countries like Norway and Germany. And this sort of, I think the way we're going to add value to discussion is not so much just being a fellow debater on what to get out of a next updated program, but how can we share best practice and add value to the discussion so we end up with stronger programs that us as an operator will be participating in going forward. So you can see here, you may be familiar with what we do in your state, but globally we've got almost 85,000, 84,000 reverse vending machines just placed alone. We're collecting 40 billion containers, and just a simple exchange of the deposit and handling fees between parties is in the billions. And this is just a very simple look at programs. And this is in its simplicity, it tells a lot. Not only can our deposit systems highly effective and can achieve rates over 90%, but even the, let's say, lower performing programs are doing better, are doing at least 3 times better than just regular drop-off or curbside programs. So we see that this is something that's not, this is a program, no longer are we talking about whether it's one versus the other. It's if we have it, how can we replicate the high performing ones, but also how can we take the infrastructure, the investment, the programs we have today and make them high performing. We have on this slide a lot of countries, programs around the world. As you'd expect, a lot of winners in the European market. We have a few with Michigan and Oregon. But we know the Northeast programs, and we've known this for a number of years, have not been performing at where they had been in the past. And for various reasons, which I think we're all familiar with, whether it's just the fact that the debate or the discussion about improvements has to happen in the political arena. But the time seems right now to look at that. And we're seeing how Massachusetts and Connecticut, even New York, are really performing at a subpar level. I think it's something we can all get our minds around, that needs to be addressed. This is a graphic. Actually, it talks a little bit about something Susan had mentioned earlier about programs sort of performing at half, sort of being a half a program or 3/4 of a program of what they potentially could be. Again, deposit systems were created at a time when and included containers that were on the market at that moment. For reasons of the way that the statutes were written, some of the programs have not been updated or kept up with what's placed on the market. So you can see a high-performing program like Michigan is really only collecting about half, a little bit more than half of the beverage containers in its marketplace. Connecticut and New York, when they added water bottles, closed that gap a bit. And again, this is just about coverage of the program, not the volume or the return rates that are happening. But you can see the program already has a significant amount of containers in it. And then you get California, Maine, even Oregon that have gone into full expansion, maybe minus a couple categories like wine and liquor, but are capturing the majority of beverage containers put out in the marketplace. So you see it's possible. So why are some succeeding and others not? So rather than getting into jumping straight into the specifics of what kind of collection program we should be looking at, how many more redemption centers we should see, even specifics of just what the handling fee should be, we think we need to sort of start off with a set of principles that help us guide our thoughts or our design for those details. And these are principles that we found are common in all those high-performing programs. And the first of which is performance. This is actually the setting of a collection target. And with that, having a deposit level that's meaningful. So the program becomes results-oriented. Might sound kind of silly. This is actually how a lot of the stewardship programs are organized. This is how we run our businesses and organizations. But for some reason, we don't have this in our recycling programs, and it certainly wasn't included in the original deposit programs. So that kind of change actually would be helpful, I think, in aligning not only interests and commitments, but also investments for success. The redemption system needs to be, and I mean redemption, I mean the collection for the consumers, needs to be easy, accessible, and fair for everyone. Not just high volume redeemers or the folks that are collecting litter off the streets, but the original consumer. We need to be able to make it easy for them to get the deposit back. And that's why we'll talk about the opportunity or the benefit of having a return to retail infrastructure in addition to high volume redemption centers. Producer responsibility. This is one of the EPR programs, product stewardship programs that has been in place for decades, and I think some of the new discussion around EPR could benefit from this. But our point here is that because producers are managing the system, because they have the responsibilities for pickup and making sure the program's successful, and they're financing it, that they should have access to the unredeemed deposits and the commodity revenues from the sale of the material. These were sort of the way these programs were originally set up. These were, I don't want to say promises, but the understanding that because it was a stewardship program, because it was defined in law, they would have access to that money. But there's also a bit of a license to operate, and that's the responsibility part, is that those monies are not just to offset costs, but also to reinvest in the infrastructure. And I think this is a complex issue, but it's very important, and I think it's going to be relevant to discussions, especially when we're talking about modernizing the systems we have today. And the last point is around system integrity, and this is an umbrella term, not just to talk about fraud, unauthorized redemption, but we need to start from the accounting systems, the management of monies flowing, data, being able to draw more data out of the system that operators like Tomra have because of the RVM network. But that will be very helpful for the producers and other operators to have trust and transparency in the system's performance and allow us to actually operate more cost effectively. With those principles, and I'm not going to go through all of these today, but we have identified about 12 key elements of the programs that are worth noting, and making sure when bills are being drafted, regulations are being drafted, or even just program responsibilities are being considered, that these are prioritized, and then that will allow us to have an effective program. So I'm going to spend some time just going through a few examples. And the first of which, and I think this is probably the most obvious, is having a meaningful deposit value will deliver results. So that's pretty evident when we look at just the U.S. states, the ones that have moved up to a 10-cent deposit, some that have maybe a mixed valued system because of different containers like wine and liquor, and those that are underperforming. This is probably the most effective driver when we consider sort of upping the game on the performance of programs. Setting performance targets. Again, believe it or not, each one of these countries had a different reason or different approach to setting its rates, and we'll talk about all of them now. But Norway, for example, actually has a 95% recovery target, doesn't actually specify deposit return as the solution. That's what the industry chose as its way to, the beverage industry chose as its way to get to that target, because if it doesn't meet it, there's a tax. That's the stick behind the door. And then that's what engages not just the beverage producers, but also the retailers, to make sure that they've got a highly effective system which engages the consumers for returns. Pivoting into Quebec, Quebec currently has no target, but its government this year made a commitment that first it wants to achieve a 75% redemption rate by 2025. And then by 2030, achieve 90%. And it's moving its redesign or modernization process with those targets in mind. And that's how the stakeholders are being aligned right now in the future design. Even Oregon. Oregon, we know, is performing close to 90%, but it set a target saying that it didn't want to perform at anything less than 80%. And it set a trigger. And this is just a unique, interesting way to approach this, by suggesting that once that it hit, if the program is performing below 80%, a trigger would go into place and it would raise the deposit. Mentioned before about convenience, or making redemption easy for the original consumer first, and then allowing the program's strength of having a deposit value bring in containers that are either littered or wasted. But the high performers, again, are all relying first on a strong return to retail infrastructure. Some of them have stopped at that, and that's where the program, that's all the program offers. But in some cases, like Oregon, the system operators have still keeping the return to retail infrastructure in place. It is also built out other collection centers to help address larger volumes and places where they could have some efficiencies of scale. This is just a visual. We actually use this in a presentation to some California, to a California Recycling Commission, to point out sort of the reverse is that, but you can see a state like Michigan, with its return to retailer mandate, the density of points of return at both at large and small retailers for consumers in a city like Detroit. And then in California, which has a population 4 times the size, it's the way it has approached its services to the consumer, the way it's set up its deposit system. You could have one redemption center for the whole city of San Francisco, and for a lot of reasons, this is a system that's in failure, and will be, or already is getting attention for reform. We also have found that the high performers is a way that the government and the stakeholders or the producers made arrangements was that the program revenues, in other words, the unredeemed deposits, the commodity values, and any other fees associated that the producers would have to pay themselves, are all used within the system and to offset costs and allow the producers to reinvest in the program. Oregon provides a great example. This was a highly motivated organization, OBRC, to keep the unredeemed deposits when that was being debated. Clearly, or it was evident at the time, the system had been let go and wasn't enticing for consumers. But the promise was made that if the unredeemed were kept, that organization would reinvest in its infrastructure. And as a result, you see success stories like the plastics recycling reclaimer or PET. You see programs like a refillable beer program, and probably more importantly, you see that they actually invested themselves in these high volume redemption centers to complement the return to retail infrastructure. And I think I'm getting into probably I think it's the last example, but probably, like I said, one of the more complex and one of the to understand. And I maybe want to pivot off to the next slide first and sort of explain in the Northeast and in a number of other states in the U.S., Michigan, Iowa, we have more what we call a decentralized redemption system versus a centralized one. Now, centralized ones, we've heard people, I think there have been some presentations recently from OBRC to explain how they're working. And in a state like that, a group like that can have almost 98% coverage of the state. You can get a lot of efficiencies from that, easier to make decisions, and on complex issues like maybe it's border fraud, maybe it's how handling fees are or are not paid, where investments are made. But in the Northeast, because they were designed after the old refillable programs, what we have is a bit of a decentralized model. It still works. Companies like Tomra and Vipco are system operators, and you're able to see with our customers, retailers and beverage companies, even redemption centers, they're able to see the efficiencies of having a third-party pickup agent, centralized clearing, or access to the reverse vending technology, and the benefits that gives. Where we fall short a bit is there's some challenges about transparency, taking data and applying it to other challenging issues like cross-border redemption or other accountability concerns. Product registration is also done not in an uncentralized way, and that's difficult since that's the information we all need as redeemers to be able to get the money back. So when we talk about a centralized, I sort of want to throw out a concept. It's not just calling it as having one central system operator. It's actually looking at it in two ways. There's their administration responsibilities and their operations responsibilities. And as we consider this in each state where this could be an opportunity, it's those responsibilities that we need to identify. What are the most priorities? Is it unifying the pickup and processing collection, or is it working on addressing issues like product registration or fraud management, or how pickup and processing fees are calculated? So that's just to sort of demystify that. I'll leave this alone at this point, but these central organizations are typically owned and operated by the producers, and that at times can also include retailers at the table. They're obviously the supply chain, the points of the supply chain that are the most responsible. So if they're assigned targets, they can then set up the system to work towards that. But we've seen in different high-performing programs, the organization set up different ways with different responsibilities. but we do find that the performance is much stronger when there is an organization. And that's coming from Tamara, who actually we see a lot of those benefits by having a large number of members in our system. We even feel that it could be stronger to be part of something more collaborative.
So Chuck,
Yes,
running a little bit over time, so
okay.
just talk faster.
No, that's fine. Not the first time I've heard that. So thanks, everyone. I just want to finish up on Norway is one of the best practices on a central system group. Because of that high target that I mentioned before, this is one of those markets where, have you worked in the business for a long time, it is a very different approach, a very different system operator. The positiveness, the progressive thinking on trying to advance the performance of the program. And you see creative incentives, such as if certain barcodes are used to help address cross-border redemption, that turns out to be a cost reduction in producer fees because it has a net benefit for the system as a whole. And just I'll close it here, Lynn, just suggesting that Tamara's going to continue to talk about this. We're actually going to put out a white paper and try to get more into the detail for folks that want to read up on these best practices. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Chuck. Terrific. So meant to mention with the last presentation, it wasn't the last presentation, but with Susan, that we actually have a document that she shared that you can download that is in the handout section of that dashboard. And there's just one document there. It's a PDF. So you can double click on that and download it. It's about the history, international history of container deposit laws. So excellent reading. Susan wrote it. I also want to, while we are getting a number of great questions, remind people to use the question box for additional questions. And let's see. And it looks like Sarah is ready to go. So you have to unmute yourself, but apart from that, Sarah, you're in great shape. And if you want to turn your camera on, that would be great too.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you, Nert, for inviting me to present today. I'm going to touch on some of the points that Susan and Chuck have already touched on, but the title of this presentation is kind of modern deposit systems. So I'm going to look at some of the changes that we're seeing really across the globe in terms of how deposit systems are implemented, talking a little bit about how they support the circular economy, but also talking a little bit more about how they support existing curbside systems. So there's often been this kind of discussion that, we have a curbside system, why do we need a deposit? And basically both these systems are just different mechanisms for collecting as much of that packaging material that we have in our waste stream as possible. So I'm going to touch a little bit on that. But first, I've got just a few slides just to give you an overview of Eunomia, because you may not have heard of us. So we're an environmental consultancy, kind of very mission-driven organisation that's been in operation for 20 years now. And we have over 100 consultants that really focus on waste and resource management and the circular economy. And I think we're probably one of the global leaders working on the circular economy and deposits as well. And I'll touch a little bit about some of our projects that we've managed over the last 10 years. And I think, one of our focuses is really about maintaining resources as resources, and so that they can flow in that continual motion around the circular economy to reduce our impact on the environment. So some of the benefits, some of the projects that kind of work we're doing today. So we're in the middle of a very interesting and in-depth piece of work around looking at the cost benefits of extended producer responsibility for a broad range of packaging materials, and also looking at deposit refund systems specifically for beverages in Washington State, and that work will be out probably later this year. We've recently released a report looking at the role of life cycle analysis in plastic policy making, and that was for the Break Free from Plastics as non-profit, We've done a large amount of work on extended producer responsibility in British Columbia and Alberta, again, looking at the role of EPR as a mechanism to drive up recycling rates, increase the amount of recyclables that can be fed into the circular economy. And we've done a lot of work in Europe recently around some of the more complex issues around extended producer responsibilities, which is related to how fees are modulated and how to prevent free riding in systems and things like that. So we've got a very, very long history of understanding extended producer responsibility, and for which deposit systems are a form of EPR. So this slide here just, I hope, kind of gives some justification as to why NERC asked us to talk today about deposits. We have extensive experience in this area, as you know, many of the systems that Susan highlighted that are now coming to the forefront, we have had a role in developing the design and assessing the costs and benefits of those. And you know, this includes in North America, where we've done work with Tom Rowe looking at kind of the economic benefits of deposits in New York City, but we've done specifically places in Ontario, for instance, on the cost benefits of having a DRS working alongside the curbside services. So pretty much every DRS system that's, you know, come to the forefront in the last 5 years, we've had some input into its design. So why kind of deposits really getting this renewed energy, I suppose? And I think there is broadly a more wider interest in North America around extended producer responsibility. And as I said before, DRS, deposit refund systems, are the original and the most successful type of EPR system. So even when you look at EPR for other packaging material in countries overseas in Europe, they're not achieving some of those redemption rates that Susan and Chuck have highlighted. You know, there's no programs under EPR that are achieving 90% recycling or redemption rates for the material that those producers place on the market. Well, there seems to be a huge amount of interest in terms of brands, and most of the major brands now have made some commitments, including Nestle, Coca-Cola in Europe, maybe not in North America, around recognizing the role that deposit systems play. There's been Susan mentioned there's a bit of a supply chain crisis in terms of having that reverse supply chain of recycled material falling back into the supply chain. So the impact of COVID-19, for instance, on the closure of some of the redemption centres, was noted by many of the packaging associations in North America, that really highlighted and made point of stating that a huge amount of the supply of rPET, for instance, comes from deposit systems, and you know, that's something that Susan touched on earlier. There's been an industry association turnaround, so the Can Manufacturers Institute and NAPCOR have all come out again with their principles around what they see as a good deposit system, much like some of those system elements that Chuck has just spoken to. And there's kind of global and local market pressures. So, you know, we're seeing in Europe single-use plastic bans. We're seeing even at a local level some communities banning water bottles. And obviously, Susan touched on the fact that we've now seen the first kind of DRS, deposit refund system, bill at a federal level. So it feels like a very different environment than it was even just 2 years ago in the US specifically. So yeah, sorry. So I wanted, like Susan and Chuck, just to highlight, I suppose, again, the benefits that a deposit system play on overall recycling rates for just two products, so PET plastic bottles and aluminium beverage cans. So hopefully you can see my little cursor here. So at the top here, we have Maine. So Maine has a DRS system, has a very wide scope. Chuck talked about some systems have excluding water, for instance, because they haven't been updated. So it has a very wide scope in terms of the beverages that are covered. You know, it has a fairly low deposit, 5 cents for the smaller bottles and 15 cents for the larger ones. But it has an extensive redemption network. And, you know, alongside that, it does have a very good curbside coverage. And from recent analysis that we've been doing, Maine has been highlighted as the state with the highest recycling rates for both PET bottles and aluminium cans. And you can see there an 80% and 88% respectively recycling rate for those materials. If we go to the next one, Massachusetts, as we spoke about before, it has a DRS system, but the scope is much narrower. So the plastic mineral water bottles that Susan said are the bulk of the market now, are not in scope. So there's no water in their system, and the deposit system is only 5 cents. It also has a relatively good curbside system, but you can see the difference there in terms of the impact that the scope of the deposit system makes on the overall recycling rate. So aluminium cans, they have a high recycling rate, 78%, but because a large bulk of the containers, beverage containers, aren't included in the program, it significantly reduces our overall PET beverage recycling rate. The next one we look to here is Washington. So Washington is probably one of the leading states in terms of recycling rate for packaging in general. It has 90% of its households, single family and multifamily, covered by a curbside or equivalent service. So there really is high level of access. Yet there's obviously no DRS in Washington, and you can see there that the PET and the aluminium cans are significantly less than Maine, who has both a good extensive curbside system for packaging as well as a DRS system. And then lastly, actually that's supposed to obviously say Colorado has no DRS system and has relatively limited curbside. So I think only 7 out of the 10 largest cities don't have really a universal curbside access for their residents. And you can see the low recycling rate there. So hopefully that gives you a little indication of just how deposit systems can supplement, even when you're a very good recycling state, can add a lot of value when you're looking specifically at these types of containers. And obviously, as Susan said, these are the containers that are littered the most. So what are we looking at when we're working with our clients around what the goals of a modern DRS system are in the US? So we want to maximize redemption rates in order to prevent litter and maximize the quantity and value of recyclable materials. So this touches a little bit on what Chuck said, and we're very much support legislation that includes our target and a high target around 90% as we know can be delivered. We want to be able to provide equitable access for all residents, so convenient redemption points, common stop approach. So this is, again, talking to some of the points that Chuck said around making sure that it's easy for the consumer to redeem. And, return to retail is one option, which I'll touch on, but there are other approaches. What we want to try and do is reduce vehicle movements and make sure that people can redeem as easy as they can consume. And we want to supplement and enhance the recycling system without jeopardising the curbside services. So we know there's been a huge amount of pressure on curbside services over the last 3 to 4 years, material managing the impact of China. And so we want to look at a system that can support those curbside services and make them even stronger at collecting other packaging materials. We want to make sure that programs are dynamic and relevant to current environment, so that legislation doesn't maintain, for instance, or set a deposit value that can't be adjusted over time, that isn't flexible enough to include new beverages as and when they come on board. So having that flexibility that, to a certain degree, we can see Oregon has, which allowed it to increase its deposit to 10 cents. We want to, where possible, incorporate requirements and targets around recycled content, which is clearly what California has done without, as a side piece of legislation, but can easily be incorporated into the DRS system. And we want to try and incentivize refill. And Chuck obviously highlighted how in Oregon they're able to do that and support a refill program for beer. But looking at potentially what they're doing in other countries is having some targets around refill there. So in terms of the kind of stakeholders, I'm going to very quickly go through this. I'm probably speaking very quickly, and I apologize. But what we're looking for in terms of consumers and the customer convenience is that having a multiple redemption points. So what we're modeling in new systems is 1 redemption point for every 5,000 population, or that the household being able to reach a redemption point in no more than 5 miles. We're looking at multiple redemption options, so not just return to retail, but looking at options that include RVMs, as they obviously are able to give you instant cash, a receipt, so the user can claim that money instantly. We're looking at kind of bag drop programs, which I will touch on in a minute, where you can have an online account and it's much quicker for you to drop off a large number of containers and then have that money inputted into an online account, and we're obviously looking at redemption centres because they do provide that role for bulk redemption. We're looking in general, in order to try and maintain this common stop approach, that there is a requirement for retailers of a certain type to be included in the programme, to provide that common stop approach that I spoke about, but very much also around giving them some choice around how they are involved in the programme. So not just looking at having return in retail, but being able to utilise parking lots and having return in specific areas within that the retailer's kind of property area, and also allowing for some exemptions to be met as long as the geographical coverage target is met. So as I said here, that we're looking for access points, 1 in per 5,000 people or population. What we would like is for that to be placed in legislation, and the central system operator, or as Chuck said, the producer responsibility organisation that may oversee the programme, being obligated to demonstrate that they've met that redemption target of the geographical coverage target, so that there is that access. We want to be able to allow to have a greater role in the system. So we have the choice potentially for them to provide what is called a counting centre role, which is verifying units that go through a modern deposit system to make sure that they're not being reclaimed fraudulently and receiving a handling fee for that. We want them to have some access to the unclaimed deposits that Chuck referenced, that in most states where there is a system now may go back to the general fund at the state level, but having access to some of those when the producer does not meet its target. So we talked a little bit about targets and setting a 90% target. So if the producers don't meet that target, then the MRFs and the municipalities having access to a fund that can support investment in the infrastructure, the wider recycling infrastructure. And we want them to be able to basically claim the deposit that for the materials that go through their facilities as well, so that they can have the access for the material that residents may choose to continue to put in their curbside systems. We recommend that there's a government agency or an oversight agency, and their role is very much around compliance and audit and monitoring of the systems and making sure basically that the producers are meeting their targets. So having systems where there's clear lines of reporting to such that producers have to register the products that they place on the market, those beverages, including their, the barcode, the unique barcodes that allow us RVMs to verify, the beverage that's been redeemed, and also the redemption rates. And obviously managing, the fund that effectively the unclaimed deposits it feeds into to support that MRF municipality network. And then producers are responsible, obviously, for meeting the redemption targets, any refill targets and recycled content targets, as well as the geographical coverage target that I spoke about, so that 1 in 5,000 redemption points per population. Having a role in education, and then, appointing that central management organisation or producer responsibility organisation that can help oversee and ensure that the system is delivered cost effectively for its members. I'm probably going to run out of time, so this is a very kind of crazy looking diagram, but it seeks to try and explain how materials and money moves around the system. But I think there's a couple of things here to highlight. So here we can see that in the future we're looking at more than just return at retail, but looking at kind of including that bag drop system, so there's more consumer choice and more retailer choice. And then in the future also there's a potential, just finished work with Metals Recycling Europe, looking at the role of using blockchain so that people can actually recycle and claim their deposit on the go. So you can have an app on your smartphone, and then when you do deposit that beverage container when you're out in the street into a specific bin with a barcode reader, you can then effectively claim that deposit back, and then the municipality or the central system operator or PRO collects from those containers. So there's lots of things going on to make the system more convenient and more transparent and more accountable. This slide gives you a little bit of a flavour again for some of the different redemption channels, which some of you may already know, but we've got the traditional redemption centre, sort of the reverse vending machines that are in stores. Here on the right hand side here is actually a kind of independent kiosk that you might find in a retailer's parking lot, and this is actually in Lithuania. So you have a barcode and a specific account, and you can go in and then reclaim through a RVM your containers, so you're not directly in store, but you are at a location close to the store where you would normally shop. These are the bag drop programs, or the remote ones that are in Oregon, and then this is just another schematic of that kind of on-the-go technology that allows you to redeem or claim your deposit as you're consuming in the street. I just wanted to touch on the piece of work that we've been doing for a state that hasn't got a deposit and looking for a deposit. And here we have basically, this is their current performance. So you can see here the yellow bar, the yellow part of the bar is how much material is recycled through the curbside system, with the majority of containers going, or PET, HDPE, and glass going into the trash effectively. The bar to the right here is when you have a 70% redemption rate on your containers, and then moving to 80% and 90%. So you can see progressively when you implement the DRS system, there is a migration, of course, of some beverage containers from the curbside program, the curbside recycling program. A large percentage also comes from the trash system. So as you move through these scenarios, then you effectively, the diagram here shows you the additional containers that are recycled as a result of that program. So under a 70% redemption rate, you get 1.8 billion containers, additional billion containers in the system. When you move to 90%, you get 2.3 billion and an additional 126,000 tons of material being recycled. So it just demonstrates that even when you have a relatively good curbside system, the DRS system is a much more higher, bigger incentive to maximize returns. And then finally, this is my final slide, which has got even more numbers on it, so I do apologize. But here I'm going to try and present the costs and benefits, I suppose, some of the costs and benefits to the different stakeholders, because we're often, as I said, talked about what happens if I expand my deposit system, and what will be the impact on curbside services? What happens if I implement a DRS system? What will be the impact on my curbside services? So this is trying to attempt to look at when we have those, the ability for some of the unclaimed deposits going back into supporting the wider infrastructure, what that looks like in terms of impact. So first of all, there's a disposal fee reduction. So as I said, material moves from the trash stream into the DRS system, and so there's a reduced fee for disposal. There's obviously a loss for material recycling facilities, because material moves from the curbside system where they'd normally some of that material would normally be deposited, and that moves into the DRS system. There's a cost on the MRFs. There's also a cost because they have a less volume going through their facilities, so there's a loss in tipping fees as well. But there's a benefit, because as I said before, there's now an element of the unclaimed deposits that can go back to support the MRFs and the wider municipality infrastructure. And there's the ability to have some of the unclaimed deposit, as I said, the item before was about the deposits paid to MRFs for the material that goes through the MRF. So there's always going to be deposit material that will continue to be put in their curbside containers, and so having access to the deposit associated with that is another further income stream. And then, as I said before, there's the ability under modern deposit systems for all containers that aren't processed through a reverse vending machine, because the reverse vending machine has the ability to verify the container redeemed. For those containers that go through a bag drop system, for instance, to be verified through a counting centre. And this is a function that, in theory, a MRF could provide on contract to that central system operator or producer responsibility program manager. And then I'm just going to present the MRF impact and then the total benefit. So let's just look at, if we implement a system and on year one, we reach 70% redemption. So overall,
this is Lynn. Are you able to wind it up in the near future?
Yeah, this is my
Great,
last slide. So
okay.
I'm just going to basically, so there's also, as I said, a lot of numbers here, but when you have a 70% redemption rate and you have the unclaimed deposits, a proportion of the unclaimed deposits going back to the MRF infrastructure, then overall, regardless of some of the losses in the system as a result of material loss or loss in tipping fees, there's a benefit to the MRF system in this state of 89 million, and an overall benefit to the system in terms of if you incorporate the savings in landfill disposal of 110 million. So significant. And then as you move through the system, obviously there's less unclaimed deposits to move into that fund. So there's a slight reduction in benefit to the MRFs and to the wider system. But even when you reach the 90% redemption rate, overall the system has a net benefit to system costs. So very quickly, DRS and Curbside, why should they go together? Why should we be supporting this? There's the significant increase in recycling that cannot be achieved through curbside systems alone, and the programs that we have in place in the US demonstrate that. The cost impacts on MRF and municipalities can be mitigated by specific measures that I've highlighted today, and there are choices for retailer-based redemption. So we can have not necessarily just return into retail, but return at retail, where we have those kiosks and bag drop programs in parking lots. And there's ability to capture more of that high quality material, specifically PET, for food grade applications, which is clearly what is being driven by some of the large beverage producers. It is EPR, and we should not forget that. So there are systems, demonstrated systems in the United States of extended producer responsibility where producers are paying. And just last point, the kind of full case study that I've presented here will be available soon towards the end of the year. So hopefully I'll have the opportunity to delve into that and get more detail. That's me.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fabulous. Lots of information, and we have lots of questions for everybody. So I'm going to encourage the panelists to unmute themselves and turn their cameras on. And the first question that we have that I wanted to highlight is, how can an EPR law and a container deposit law coexist? And maybe Susan, could you start us off with that, please?
Sure. Well, they do coexist just in the way that any side-by-side recycling programs can operate in any province. I think Germany is a good example where people store their beverage containers in their homes before they take them into stores for redemption. They do that along with their weekly shopping. And then side by side with that, they're also separating out into many different sorts the rest of their household recyclables and composting, and lastly garbage. That's true all throughout Northern Europe. Sweden is another example where people sort into multiple containers inside of their homes, and they take their beverage containers back for redemption. Closer to home, the province of Ontario, Canada is operated that way, as are a few other Canadian provinces, British Columbia. And in some cases, like British Columbia, the deposit program came first, and then they added EPR for packaging pretty recently, about between 5 and 10 years ago. It was the other way around in Germany. The EPR program for packaging was there first, and then the deposit law started in about 2005. So we've seen all combinations, and they can all work. And if the best thing is that the more recycling programs you have, the more recycling you're going to get. So we need recycling programs for all materials.
Right. So another question we have is, how can container deposit laws incentivize reuse? I know there was some mention of this, but it would be great to hear more specifically from people, literally how that would work. So Chuck, do you have anything do you want to start us with an answer to that?
Well, sure. I think, I don't know. the way I look at the refillable programs, because this is actually the space where Tomra started its business, was actually providing the technology for refillable systems. And like I mentioned before, the one way the programs that we have in the U.S. today were developed as a result of those systems being turned off in the U.S., but they were modeled after them because it's a workable model. But the way I think it just goes back to the same thing we talked about before with high-performing systems. You have to start off with commitments. Their refillable systems in Europe typically are about market protection, but there are also targets that have to be achieved, and you'd look at it from that case. If you're talking about how to literally make an incentive in the deposit system, you could suggest that any containers that are produced under a refillable return network are not subject to handling fees and the other requirements of the existing program. Quite frankly, they can work together.
Great. Sarah or Susan, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I mean, I will just follow on a little bit from Chuck's point. So some of the work that we've been doing on kind of fee modulation within extended producer responsibility programs, not just DRS, has, is around the fact that generally producers pay for a system when they put a product on the market or place a material in the state. So if you're putting single-use plastic bottles into the state, you're going to pay for every single-use plastic bottle that you sell into the state. If you're using refillables or reusables, then you only pay the first time or once. If you have that container going around the system 10 times, you just pay once. Whereas if you're constantly putting single-use items in the system, you're going to pay for every single-use item. So there's a financial incentive to not put single-use items on the market and look at refillable models. Yeah, and I think the way EPR works around what Chuck spoke about, around kind of a central system administrator or producers coming together, means that there's more possibility for investment in those types of programs. There's a huge amount of investment needed in refillable infrastructure, and so you can see what's happening in Oregon by the fact that they've got parties together to invest and have economies of scale to enable what is kind of a U-turn in terms of, we all used to have refillable programs many years ago. So it requires a lot of investment. So you can only really do that when you've got a lot of parties coming together.
Okay, great. So we've had several questions that one way or another relate to how could we politically get more of these laws to pass. So some of the questions focus on the brand owners, some focus on the system, some focus on whether we'd have better luck at a federal level if we just had a bill that was just about bottle bills. So it's a lot of different questions, but they all ultimately, in my opinion, come down to the punchline of what are the obstacles? How can we get these things passed or modified for those that do exist? So Susan, if you could start us off, and I'd love to hear from all three of you on that.
Sure. So the history is that bottle bills have always been really popular everywhere but in the halls of power. They've been really, really popular with people, and we've seen polls that have been done in state after state, country after country, and these, we had the pollster come back to us once in a state and say that they actually had to double check all of the numbers because it came out so positive they thought somebody had made a mistake. So they poll sort of, higher than motherhood and apple pie. But the legislators seem to be coming around to this more and more these days as the beverage companies and waste haulers have been opponents, but they seem to all be coming around to it because consumers want really high recycling rates. Consumers want really high levels of recycled content. The recycled content issue is getting way more attention. And the other thing that has changed politically that is so huge is the issue of plastic in the ocean. That has gotten so much attention over the last 10 years. And it's really causing attitudes to shift, and it's causing companies to know that they have to do something to change.
Great. And Chuck, what would you like to contribute to that?
Sure. I think it's complex. Having tried to work on bills over the years, it can be frustrating. That's a very relevant question. I've asked myself how to deal with it. But over the last couple of years, we've seen how Europe, if we can take a page from them, on how they've addressed it. And the way I look at it is they set priorities. They didn't actually, the EU didn't actually tell all the countries, membership countries, that they had to set up deposit systems. But what they did say was that 90% of the beverage containers needed to be recovered. And that gave the stakeholders, whether it was the politicians, the businesses, the producers, all the impetus to come up with a way to address and reach that target. And they came to the conclusion, in most cases, there might be a couple countries that are going to try to manage this through their curbside programs, but almost all of them decided to adopt a deposit return system for one-way containers.
Okay. And
I think
Sarah?
that works well with us. No, it's okay, but I think that might actually help work with us because of the way we develop bills. We almost negotiate them before they pass. Having that sort of mandate come from the government or some political leader or the companies themselves saying that they want to do this, that'll help align stakeholders to come up with the right program.
Great. And Sarah?
I think there's obviously, some of the big brands are coming out in support of bottle bills, and so I think there's less resistance from that side, although still definitely some resistance, and greater understanding of the environmental impact of these containers in our environment. It's definitely pushing from the consumer and public side. And as you know, I think we can be less, as Chuck said and Susan, like less direct. We can set very high either collection targets or very high minimum recycled content targets. And if there's a high recycled content target, then you need a supply. And we know the supply cannot come through curbside systems alone. So it provides that incentive for producers to initiate these systems independently, potentially. But I mean, I would love for some of these beverage organizations to come out and say, this is the bill we would like to see. This is a bill that we want to see to make sure that we can get the supply. Because unfortunately, for a lot of producers of, users of PET bottles, they have to compete on the market for a limited supply of material at the moment, and that has a cost to their business. So a beverage producer that wants to make a commitment and meet 100% recycled content is having problems meeting that supply agreement because there's not enough in the market, or they are being significantly penalized because of the very low price of virgin plastic. So, we need to, hopefully we'll see a change where people, beverage producers will say, let's try and create a level playing field through policy, and we can see some change over the next few years.
Right. So again, several questions related to the next question that I'm going to create, bundling questions. Something that we've certainly heard about over the years is the potentially negative impact of a bottle bill, either a new bottle bill or a more successful bottle bill. The negative impact being on the loss of revenue to a MRF, or the loss of revenue to a residential recycling program that relies on cost sharing with a MRF. So, and of course, this is a complicated, another one of those all tangled together, but do you have observations about how a MRF can succeed if more material is pulled out? I don't know who might want to start that.
Why would you ask that question? I think she covered that.
You think so?
I covered quite a lot of that at the end of my presentation.
Okay. Okay, so that's fine, because there are lots of other questions. I just thought that maybe it was.
No, I'd like to add after Sarah's. One of the things that I'll be very frank and say that a lot of times when people bring up that topic, they're really cherry picking the data, and they're really only talking about PET and aluminum. And in the common mix of materials, 70% of the weight of beverage containers is glass. So you're really talking about taking a lot of glass that's currently some of it's being recycled, but most of it's being disposed, and instead getting it recycled, as well as the PET and aluminum. So if you look at just the micro part of the system that is the material that goes through MRFs, and again, Sarah's slide showed very clearly that the majority of beverage containers are going to disposal right now in a state that doesn't have a deposit law. So the biggest impact, of course, is there. But if you look at full cost accounting and look at all of the different elements, disposal and recycling, and how much is going through the MRF, and look at all of that, you're going to find that you're taking a lot of cost out of the system, a lot more cost out of the system than revenue. And this isn't just me saying this. We actually have a fact sheet that ReLoop put together that summarizes more than 24 studies that were done around the world that show that the cost impact is actually a positive impact. You're taking away more cost than you are taking away revenue from the MRFs and the municipalities.
Great. And Susan, is that available on your website?
I'm not sure if we've put it up on our website, but it's definitely on ReLoop's website. If you
okay, great.
Google ReLoop municipality or municipal impacts, you would be able to find that fact sheet.
Great, wonderful. So, another angle on this, early on, there were comments about poor California and how its container deposit law has been suffering. And somebody in the audience pushed back a little bit and said, yeah, but their convenience model seems to be very attractive. So Susan, you live in California. I mean, are there elements of California's existing container deposit law that actually is something you would point to as something to recommend?
I wouldn't. It's not for me. I live in one of the areas that I call a recycling desert. So the area that I live in, which is not where I am, by the way, this lovely background is the motorhome that I'm in on vacation in Utah. But where I live in Culver City on the west side of LA, the entire west side of LA, all of Santa Monica, Culver City, all of the surrounding areas, an area that has 320,000 people. We don't have a redemption center, and we don't have any supermarkets that are, doing widespread taking back. They don't have RVMs inside of the stores. So I effectively have to travel quite a bit to get to crowded redemption centers that are farther away, and there's not social distancing happening at those crowded redemption centers. And that's just me, woe is me, but it's even worse in San Francisco, where there's only one redemption center for more than 900,000 people, and the whole San Francisco Bay Area is bereft of redemption centers. So the safeguards that are in place in the law in California aren't being enforced by the state to the level that they should be. If they were, if there was a lot more enforcement of the program to force the retailers to be the backstop, then we would have a lot more redemption opportunities, and I wouldn't be saying what I'm saying right now.
Okay. Well, we'll let you be the last word on that one. We're just about out of time. One last question I'd like to, from the audience, that I'd like to put out there is the relationship between these laws and pay as you throw. So in some states, not a lot, but in some states, we're starting to see statewide pay as you throw. So should those be precursors to this, or what is the actual relationship between these two approaches to inspiring increased recycling? So Chuck, do you have a thought about that?
Honestly, I really don't. I
Okay.
think that they work in harmony, but it's from a consumer's, from an education perspective, both are seriously engage a consumer to participate and think more about their waste and recycling. But I think that might be something more for the consultants, former consultant.
Okay. Great. So Sarah, if you want to take 30 seconds to answer that complicated question, we invite you to.
I don't think that they definitely can work in parallel. I mean, one's an incentive scheme to get a specific beverage or packaging type through the system. The other one's supposed to, encourage waste minimization and recycling of other packaging materials. So I think they coexist and work perfectly well together.
Great, thank you. So much, you guys, fabulous job. Thank you so incredibly much. And to our wonderful sponsors, these webinars wouldn't happen without them. I want to point out that NERC has a lot of webinars coming up, and one in particular you might be interested in. It's all about plastics, a complex global topic, and that will be on December 8th. You can find all of our upcoming webinars and registration links on our homepage. And speaking of our homepage, the PowerPoint presentations and the recording will be available on the NERC website tomorrow, and you will get an email about that. And again, thank you so incredibly much, everybody. And I look forward to having you on a future webinar. And goodbye, and have a good balance of your afternoon. Take care, everybody.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Lynn.
You're welcome.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Lynn.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.